This episode is supported by Technor Apex, maker of the Zero G hose, the hose that takes the work out of yard work. Look for it at your local hardware store or home store. I'm making the molding out of old 2x4s, and some of these had construction adhesive on them, so I wanted to clean that up with my power plane. And then I brought them over to the joiner, a few passes over the joiner. Then over at the table saw, I ripped all the boards down to 2.5 inches. I'll make the jig out of 3/4 inch plywood, and I'll run the plywood through the saw a little more than halfway and then turn the saw off. Next, I'll attach a 1/2 inch piece of plywood to the jig as a fence and clamp the jig in place. To make this cove, I've attached a plywood fence at a 38-degree angle to the blade. I'll run the boards along the fence and remove this material. I can't remove all of this material in one pass, so I'll have to lower the blade, make one pass with every board, then raise the blade a little bit and run all the boards through again and repeat that process until I get to the depth that I'm looking for. I'm going to attach a piece of 3/8 bead molding to the outside edge of the frame. So I'll need to mill that material first before swapping out the saw blade for the molding cutter head. For this piece of molding, I'm using poplar, and I'll get started by ripping the material at 2 3/8. And then I'll raise the blade, set the fence at 3/8 of an inch, and resaw the boards. I've set the height of the blade so I rip the material a little more than halfway through, make the first cut, flip the board over, and then finish the cut. Now I'm ready to set the saw up to make the molding. So I've unplugged the saw, I'll swap out the saw blade for the molding cutter head, and then I'll be ready to add the bead to the cove molding and make the bead molding that I'm attaching to the outside of the frame. This is an old Craftsman molding cutter head. I bought this at Sears 25 or 30 years ago. I'm not sure if they're still available at Sears, but you should be able to find something like this or maybe the exact same thing online. Now I'm ready to cut the bead molding into the top of the cove molding, and I've set the fence so the bead will be right at the top of the cove. And I always run a few test pieces first to make sure I like the exact location and depth of the bead before I start running all the molding through the saw. Notice the only thing near the table saw insert is the push stick. You always want to keep your hands as far away from the blade as possible. Take your time and always be careful. If you're not comfortable doing something, just don't do it. Once I've finished cutting all of the molding into the Douglas fir cove molding, I'll reset the fence and cut the bead into the 3/8 poplar molding. I'm using a feather board as I make the 3/8 molding. Not only is it safer, but it keeps the molding or the material up tight against the fence, and that gives you a perfect profile. Now I'm ready to make the frame, and I'll start by making a miter cut on one side of all 4 pieces of molding. And then I'll measure and mark a line for the cut and align the mark with the kerf that's on my sacrificial fence, and then make the cut. To build the frame, I'm using wood glue and 1.25" nails in the nail gun. This frame is going to be a float frame, and the molding isn't quite deep enough, so I'm going to have to pad the back out a little bit, and I'll do that with strips of 1/4-inch plywood that I've ripped to 1 1/4 inches. I'm attaching the 1/4-inch plywood flush with the inside of the frame, and I'm using butt joints, and I allow the 1/4-inch plywood to overlap the miter, and that adds a little bit to the strength of the miter joint. To add even more reinforcement to the miter joint, I'm using a 2-inch screw, and I'll pre-drill and countersink first. Next, I'll rip strips of 1/4-inch plywood at 2 inches, again to attach to the back of the frame. The 2-inch plywood will overhang the inside of the frame by 3/4 of an inch and provide a surface to attach the painting to the frame.